Welcome to another video lecture here at AP World History. This time we're going to deal with land-based empires. And this is really important because this time around what we're going to take a look at is what happens when you build these large empires in dealing with the many different types of people that are going to get conquered at this time. So really the themes that we're looking at here have to do with governance, and it has to deal with the administration of how do you get all these different types of peoples to live under one roof, essentially. So, one of the key defining elements of the post-classical age was the centralization of political authorities. And I really want to make a big key issue out of this theme of centralization. Remember, humans started off in these small sort of filial-based hunter-gatherer societies. When humans then eventually settled down into sedentary communities, the populations expanded due to food surpluses from the agricultural revolution. This created a need to go out and trade with other societies to get exotic goods. Trade and food surpluses led to larger and larger populations, and that led to a new problem. And the problem with this is that as you needed more food, as you needed bigger populations, you became vulnerable to environmental collapse. So how do you solve that problem? Well, the solution came along in the development of empires. Authorities centralized their governing power. This allowed them to create projects like irrigation projects. That led to more food production. Then they created bureaucracies who kept track of these developments, food, and the needs of the population. Bureaucracies then led to the need for greater education of the elite, and the elite then needed a justification for their power. So this brought up ideologies of religion, filial obligations, and legal structures. Along with trade, societies also expanded due to military conquering. This came as both a defense against outsiders, like the steppe people, and this came from a desire to find new resources for the empire. But expansion and conquering came with its own problem. How do you manage diverse religious, language, and ethnic groups who you have conquered? Well, let's look at a few different models of how you do this. So, number one, tolerance. First model is based upon tolerance, and I want to take a look at the Ottoman Empire for this. So the Ottoman Turks, or the Seljuk Turks, come from Central Asia and the steppe region. Their leader, Suleiman the Great, was able to slowly over time take over a weakened Byzantium Empire. Then they spread out and took over areas stretching out to northern Africa. They established the largest and strongest navy of the time period. Their empire would influence areas ranging from the Middle East to northern Africa to southern Europe. So the big issue that came up was how do you manage all these various ethnic, religious, and linguistic minorities in the region? They did this through tolerance. How so? First, they established what are called local millets, or communities. The people in these millets could run their own local areas using their own religions and their own governments. So if you were from a Muslim community, you ran it as an Islamic community. Christian community, Jewish community, Jewish community. Next, the Ottomans would take some young boys from each of these communities through a process called the devshirme process. They would essentially kidnap from their communities. They would then take them to the capital of Istanbul. The boys would grow up and become Muslim, and then they would become leaders in the Janissary Corps, or the military leadership of the Ottoman Empire. So why do this? The reason for doing this was because now representatives of each local community served in the court of the Sultan, or the king of the Ottoman Empire. So what essentially the Ottomans are doing is they are creating a way in which local people have representatives in the central government. Okay, the Ottomans also created the harem. Now, the harem has long been misinterpreted. It was a place where women from local communities through the devshirme process were kidnapped, and they were taken to Istanbul, and they would be married to the Sultan. Now, here's where the misunderstanding is. Misunderstanding, and we just have to be upfront about this, was the idea that the Sultan would use these women for sexual pleasure. That's actually not accurate. The Sultan did have a relationship with these women that led to reproduction, but we know that it really wasn't the sort of mystical, exotic way that it's been portrayed a lot of times. How do we know this? Well, for example, there was a Catholic priest who actually visited the harem, and he said that what he saw there, he compared to a nun's rectory back in Europe. Most of the women's daily activities were learning to read the Quran, raising children, and completing other projects. So why did they do the harem? Well, eventually it is true the Sultan would have children with these women, and when he did, by doing that, each community then would essentially have a representative in the harem, and you never knew. The next Sultan could be from a Christian community, a Jewish community, or a Muslim community. In essence, what's happening here is they're incorporating people from all the different communities into the centralized government. Okay, model number 2. Model number 2 is assimilation. In the Central Asian and Middle Eastern region, there was an empire very small called the Safavid Empire. The Safavid was Shiite, it was small, and it was landlocked. One of its key leaders was a man named Shah Abbas. Shah Abbas, or the leader of the Safavids, forced everyone to become Shiite in the national religion. There was a small Sufi minority in the country. They were typically oppressed and forced into a minority status. Abbas did invite foreign leaders into the country, but he did this so that they could be his counselors and so they would create competition with the local nobles that basically checked and balanced the local noble power. So why is he doing all this? He wanted to create a sense of national unity around religious identity, the Safavid Shiite identity. Okay, model number 3, our final model, blending. The final example comes from the Mughal dynasty in India. So throughout this time, there had been a dynasty in India. It was called the Delhi Sultanate. The Delhi Sultanate ruled basically throughout this time period until a man named Babur, who comes in again from the Central Asian region, attacks northern India. He's going to conquer it, and he's going to establish what's called the Mughal dynasty. The Mughal dynasty basically, throughout most of its time period, tried to take the different religions there, so primarily Hinduism, but also Buddhism, Christianity, and Islam, and attempted to create some type of balance between all these groups. Now, the big guy who's going to be important for this is a man named Akbar the Great. Akbar the Great, who came into power, attempted to blend all of these faiths together in what he called the divine faith. The idea of the divine faith was that in essence, all faiths have basically the same ideology. Love your neighbor, love your God, love your community. Because of that, he believed eventually all of these faiths should just unite into one faith, and that way it would get rid of all the problems that was being faced. On a practical level, here's what he did. He got rid of the jizya tax, so no longer were non-Muslims having to pay an extra tax. He also allowed for intermarriage between Hindus and Muslims, and he allowed Hindu priests to be inside of his royal cabinet. Now, eventually, the problem is after Akbar the Great dies, his grandson, a man named Aurangzeb, came along, and Aurangzeb was Muslim, and he believed that his grandfather had gone down the wrong route. His grandfather had allowed for an impurity in the Islamic religion. And so because of that, he turns around and he basically institutes all those things all over again. Jizya taxes, no intermarriage, Hindus were not allowed to serve in the royal court, and in fact, he even went out and started destroying Hindu temples. What was the eventual result of this? Well, eventually India falls into an internal civil war that's going to continue until the British will be able to manipulate this in the 1700s, and they're eventually going to take over India because of it. Okay, so what are our... Okay, so what are our takeaways from this? I want you guys to see 3 big takeaways that are important. Land-based empires are an attempt to solve that problem of how do you deal with a lack of resources. So as populations grow due to agricultural surpluses, there's a need for more agricultural surpluses that grows the population more and more. There's a need to solve this. And the solution that arises is to have a large land-based empire that's expansive and that can basically get more resources. Okay, so that's our first major principle, that we get land-based empires to solve the resource problem. Our second major principle that's important is then how do you deal in expansion with different minority groups? And we have 3 different models. We have, first of all, the model of tolerance, then assimilation, and then blending. And number 3, the big principle, each one of these sort of has their upsides and downsides. So when it comes to tolerance, the upside is all the people are brought together in representation into the courts. It's not really our tolerance system though today, and so because of that, at the local level over time, people are going to feel at some point like they want their own identity. In the case of assimilation, the upside is everybody is forced into one system, which they must agree to, In the long run, that's going to cause a problem since you are using a system of forcing people into an identity. And then last off is blending. Blending is an attempt to just say, why don't we all just have one common identity? It's going to take place over time. The problem with doing that is that those people who strongly believe in their own faith, Islam versus Hinduism, are going to eventually rebel against that. So that's the big issue when it comes to centralization and management, is how do you manage different ethnic groups? Thanks a lot. See you in class.